Episode 6 of Lovecraft Country, Meet Me in Daegu. We've been wondering all this time, who is the mysterious woman on the phone? And this episode answered that question, and I was actually surprised at how much we didn't know about Atticus. I think that we had long suspected many of the things that were revealed in this episode about the woman on the phone. We expected them to have had a romantic history when he was over in South Korea during the Korean War, but we didn't know exactly what had happened and where the relationship ended. We figured that it probably ended for the reasons that most relationships end, but that wasn't true at all. And I was honestly surprised at some of the things we learned about Atticus this episode. Now, I think this was a great episode of Lovecraft Country. I'm going to stop pitting these episodes against each other, but I really did enjoy that the one-off aspect of this show allows them to tell such different stories on back-to-back weeks. And this episode was the first episode to really not be focused on the African American experience in America. This one was focused on what it was like to be a South Korean as they were occupied by the US during this war. And they very clearly drew comparisons between what it's like to be an African American in the US during this time and what it's like to be a South Korean during this time, as the US is so intent on fighting communism that they're letting a lot of innocent people die and actively killing innocent people in some cases, as maybe in this episode. And I found the way that they revealed information about the character of Jia and the way that they gradually brought us into this world to be a real masterclass in doling out information to the audience. Because initially, the setup was not what it actually seemed. Because we think at the beginning of this episode that Jia is in this, she's a nursing student and her mother wants her to prostitute herself for the good of the family. That was what the initial setup seemed like. And either that or to, marry and bring, honor to the family in that sense. And, we're set up to accept this, I think, because this is, a common plot thread in these types of stories. But what actually is going on is a lot different, and certain scenes play completely differently once you realize this. You initially think, of course, that Jia, played by Jamie Chung, is, going on these dates with these men, and that she is disappointed because she's looking for a romantic connection. But eventually, it becomes clear that she is on the prowl, that she is possessed by a spirit known as a kumiho, which is a nine-tailed fox that has apparently a basis in mythology, and she is able to use this during sex to kill men. And this happens for the first time during a very, very shocking scene, so shall we say. And it was interesting because I think that once you realize where this episode is going, the hints were there, but again, there was enough information doled out to us so that it was kind of veiled what was going on, and you didn't necessarily know where this was going until it went there. So I really appreciated the way that Misha Green and her fellow writers wrote this episode, because it was very, very intriguingly done. Now, this is the first episode of Lovecraft Country not to be based in the book by Matt Ruff. And I think it bodes well for the show that they could write such a compelling and interesting episode without any basis in the book. And I think that shows that this show could go on as long as they want to, as long as they can keep telling interesting stories like this one. Now, I think that this episode, as I said, it gave us a lot of insight into Tick, but he's very much not the protagonist. The protagonist is very much Jia, and we get to see her arc, and it's a very powerful arc, I would argue, is we see her learning to stop letting her fear shape us, as her friend, who ends up being killed by the American army because she's a communist spy, tells her that that is what she has to do. And I think this is a powerful message for 2020, and it's a powerful message for all time, honestly. And as we see Gia learn to not let her fear control her, she finds this connection with Atticus, who is someone who, like her, escapes into his fantasies. Now, their fantasies are very different. He escapes into more science fiction, and she seems to enjoy the escapism of Judy Garland films. But there's this connection between them that is, very deeply moving. And on another level, they both connect over their relationships with their parents that are very troubled. Gia's mother, or the mother of the girl that she was before she was possessed by the Gumio, she allowed her daughter to be abused by this man that she married because she had the daughter out of wedlock, and the man was looking for someone to marry so that he could molest her daughter. And she called this spirit to punish her husband for what he had done. But now Gia has to kill 100 people, 100 men, to return to her former state. And this is, a very compelling episode. In some ways, it reminded me of Let Me In and other supernatural horrors that kind of show the removal from humanity, a character that is trying to figure out what her identity is. And this show has always been about identity, but particularly this episode, it's interesting to see this character who doesn't even have the memories of the body that she inhabits, and also that she is really interested in American film, in a country that, is very much feeling perhaps not too well disposed towards Americans as they're invading them and at times treating the populace not very well. And as this episode played out, I felt that it was very interesting to see the character arc of her learning to not let her fear shape her. But in fairness, she has a little bit to be afraid of. Now, I don't know what we're supposed to think of Atticus after this episode. Now, we knew that he had done bad things in wartime. He had told his uncle that in the first episode. But his uncle had assumed, you did what you needed to in war. But here we find out that Atticus actually straight up murdered people. And it was what he was told to do. But again, it was innocent woman that he shot through the head here. And then he helped to torture Gia's friend. And again, you can lay the culpability at the people that are ordering him to do this, but simultaneously, you have to give him some culpability for following orders. And obviously, they draw another parallel between him and Gia, who has murdered countless men in order to reclaim her body so that she can have her memories once more. And I thought that this romance, honestly, was more compelling than the relationship between Atticus and Letty. I'm sorry for those of you who ship those two and feel differently. I'm sure that they'll probably be the couple that this show sticks with in the long run. But for me, I found this relationship to be more compelling from a dramatic perspective because I felt that they had more of a connection and there was more obvious reasons for them to fall in love. And the date that they had where Atticus helped her to get to watch Summer Stock and let her see the newest Judy Garland film, that was so sweet. And I feel that Atticus is a very likable character, and it's shocking to me that he could come off so well in the same episode where we watched him shoot a woman in the head for no reason, that she hadn't done anything wrong. Now, obviously, again, he's not doing it because he gets kicks off of it, and it's very much tormenting him as he tells Gia eventually. But still, very, very contrasting views of Atticus this episode. Now, I was also impressed that even though I think that a lot of this episode was focused on the relationship between Atticus and Gia, I feel like that the real heart of this episode in some ways was the relationship between Gia and her mother, Sunhee, played by Cindy Chang, who is known as Uma within the story. And Uma had an arc of her own, which was also brought up in a line expressed by Gia's friend, who Atticus eventually helped to torture and kill. And this was where she talked about how mothers often say they're doing what's best for their daughters, but they do what is best for them. And I felt that we got to see through the course of this episode Uma, who's looking at her daughter as a monster and just wants her to go through with it and do these terrible things so that she can have her daughter back. And there's obviously a comparison being made between Uma and Montrose. And once again, though, we see at the end of this episode, Uma she's come to this point where she's willing to sacrifice herself to help her daughter get what will make her happy as they go to the shaman, and she offers her own soul in exchange so that Gia doesn't have to sleep with another man and cause his death. And this arc I thought was very, very compelling, and I thought it was very well done that they could have these two arcs in the space of one episode. I also found the way that they left things with Atticus to be really interesting. We got a lot of insight into him this episode, not the least of which was, what he did in the war, which was quite unexpected, but also we got to see hints at his future in these visions that Gia had as she nearly killed him when the spirit of the Kumiho materialized as they were having sex. And the visions that she saw were very enlightening. We saw him being tortured, and it's unclear, what's going to happen, but she told him, if you go back, you'll die, which is an interesting revelation that we didn't know. Obviously, I don't think Atticus is going to stay dead if he does die. There's probably going to be time travel to save him, but it's interesting to know that he went back knowing this and why the relationship between him and Gia ended. Obviously, he told her that he could accept her no matter what, but the minute that spirit materialized, he fled, and it seems like never spoke to her again except on the phone. But he still thinks about her, as evidenced by the fact that she showed up in his dream in the first episode and during the vision in the second episode. So it's interesting. Again, it fits with the theme because we have Gia learning to stop letting her fear shape her, but we have Atticus who still hasn't learned to not let his fear shape him, and that he flees her because he's afraid by what he discovers about her. And all in all, I felt like the thematic exploration this episode was very, very well done, and I liked the change of setting. I think that it contributed to this being a very unique and interesting episode with a lot of melancholy aspects and also continued exploration of, what America has done to the rest of the world, in addition to, African Americans at home, how our invasions of other countries affected those countries. And it's interesting because the Korean War is a relatively popular war in America's history, but this show shows perhaps some of the darker aspects of it and what it would do to a country to have America invade them. I liked the use of Judy Garland this episode. I particularly thought that the speech of hers at the end was very, very impactful, and as they played it over the scene between Gia and Uma and the shaman. And I'm interested to see more of these characters. I hope this isn't the last we see of them. I'm not sure what form that will take, whether Atticus will return to South Korea or if Gia will come to the US, but I'm intrigued and want to see more of them. Next week, it seems like we're going to have an episode with Hippolyta, and it looks like they're taking this in a very, very different direction than the story in the book went, but I'm very, very much interested in this episode because I like the actress who plays Hippolyta, and I think that the story was one of the more interesting ones in Matt Ruff's novel, and it will be interesting to see what aspects of it, if any, they keep. So those are my thoughts on Meet Me in Daegu, and I'm interested in hearing your thoughts in the comments. If you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing so you can watch my upcoming reviews of other shows and movies. And if you'd give me a like, I'd really appreciate it. And always, as always, you can watch other videos right now.